Fantastic. Great. I'm going to let folks in now.
It's not, it's still loading.
Okay, that's no.
Okay, it's done.
Great. Thanks again so much, Hahnji. We're so excited that you're doing this session. All right, I will bring folks in now. Welcome, folks who are coming in. We're going to just give a couple of minutes for people to arrive, and then we'll be kicking off. Hello again, folks. We'll be kicking off in just a couple of minutes. Great time to get water, to stretch, to get ready for our wonderful session. All right. Hello, folks. Welcome to our panel, to the folks that are in the Zoom room today, as well as our friends watching on YouTube. My name is James Clements, he, him, and I'm a actor and theatre maker, as well as the producer of Global Learn, part of the Rattlestick Theatre Global Forums Theatre Festival. It's my great privilege to introduce Hahnji Jang. Hahnji is an activist, stylist, and costume designer using their passion for the fiber arts to upcycle garments and offer a full, affirming styling outside the limiting size and gender binaries of capitalism. We're so thrilled to have them as part of our programming this year, and I'm going to hand it over now to Hahnji. Welcome.
Thank you, James. Yes, hi everyone. My name, as he said, is Hahnji Jang. I use they, them pronouns, Hyung or Oppa if you want to speak Korean with me. That is also my background. I'm a Korean American artist, and that very much informs my practice as an artist who moved here from South Korea for university. That's a little bit about just like my background and how it feeds into my practice. I am a costume designer, a fabric artist, a stylist, all of the above. My biggest passion in life is putting clothes on people that are affirming and empowering for them, but also doing it in a way that is sustainable and, climate friendly and ethical in the way that I spend money and such. Today, I will be using specifically the example of a recent production called Exotic Deadly, or the MSG play, which is an amazing play by Keiko Green, and it is about the Asian American experience It's set in the 90s, centered around a Japanese American girl finding out about that she is related to the scientists who helped create the product that is MSG. And it's her discovering through this story and through time traveling and all these wild things that MSG is one, not bad for us. Actually, it's better for us than salt. And two, understanding herself and her like self in the diaspora and such. So I'm just going to kind of dive into a little bit about my costume practice. So I have just slowly over time worked to become as sustainable and as anti-capitalist as possible. And for me, that means valuing people and labor. And I really believe that there is enough material, enough clothing in the world has been made that we don't need to make anymore. Like we could stop making new clothes and we'd be good for a couple centuries with the amount of clothing and fabric that we have produced. So my goal is really to redirect things from landfill and from corporate thrift stores and things like that, so that we're keeping things out of the trash and reusing them and highlighting how in the costume process you can be ethical and focus on labor and pay people and not focus as much on materials. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So I'm going to start by talking about the main character of Exotic Deadly, Ami, who is the Japanese American girl we're seeing the world through. And so I think what I wanted to talk about here is that part of my costume process, as I've said, is very much about like identity affirming and focusing on seeing everyone as this dynamic person with this amazing intersection of experience that they are bringing to the role, to the character, to etc. And really seeing them in the costume process so that I'm truly collaborating with the actor. And so I'm pulling this up because talking about this show was really amazing with the team because we were all kind of coming from the same place, similar-ish age range, all the Asian American diaspora experience, all coming from different places, but having some of those similarities. And so able to talk about like, what were the things in the 90s that had big impact for us, like these Lizzie McGuire movie moments, like these Cher and Clueless things that are referenced in the show, and then able to like expand that out and talk about the trope of like the Asian girl in the film always being like the best friend or a background character. And so pulling a bunch of those quote unquote friend characters, screenshots from Clueless and such on here. And like really having that be the start. And then from there, going thrifting and looking at secondhand pieces and such. Yeah, so we kind of establish like the point of view, who the character we are seeing it from, this overall world. At this part, I am also discussing with the playwright and the director and the theater institution as a whole, like what are the goals for the productions, what are the overall themes and messages we're trying to get across. My work is much more holistic in that way, I guess is the word, because it really does connect with all of that. One of like my big tips that I'm giving folks now is like, and that I put in my contract or in my writers, is like when a show runs, because we work in an industry that is about this temporary live performance experience, when our purchases are permanent, what are we doing with things after? So one of the things that I put in my rider is that if costumes do not have a place to go after a production has closed, they come to me. In this case, most of the costumes stayed at the Old Globe because they have the space for storage, and that was one of the great parts of this process, was being able to go into their huge stock and pull from that and like work with them of understanding like what can I transform from stock and what can't I. So usually at this point in my process, in my design process, I have these costume boards. As you can see, all of my kind of research that I compile. I often do a split between sketching and costume boards because of the way that I work, because I'm so materials informed and I'm trying to keep myself so open to finding things and using what already exists, that often it's more of a board like one of these where it's like a whole bunch of pictures of cat sweaters, because this is our crazy cat lady teacher trope. A bunch of cat sweaters, and then we like thrifted a sweater, and so we went through this process of I had these general images, and then we were able to find here you can see we found a pink sweater that we were out thrifting, and then we purchased a whole bunch of vintage and handmade patches, cat patches from Etsy, and then attach them to the sweater so we could create this crazy cat sweater ourselves, but have it all be secondhand items. And it was really great because we were able to pull like one sweater from stock and use that, and then one out thrifting and shopping. So like I was saying, at this point in my process, I have kind of the boards, my character boards put together that show us the rough idea. And then I usually do a visit to whatever theater company I'm working with at this point. Even if we don't have final designs, I like to do a visit. I go through stock, I see what I can pull from that. Excuse me. I see what I can pull that theaters already have. There was years ago, I saw this graphic that was kind of joking, kind of serious, called the hierarchy of needs, like hierarchy of needs, but buying. So it's like the way it starts is the first layer is use what you already have. Can you transform something? Can you use something you already have? The second layer is, can you borrow or rent or exchange? Are you, so that you're not purchasing, so if these clothes are still in rotation. And then it's okay, if you can't pull from sources like that, can you find it secondhand? And so that's usually what I do. Is I go into a theater, I go through all of their stock. I often actually do what I call first exploratory fittings. So I try to get in the first week of rehearsal and do a round of fittings with all of the actors, with all of the stock that is available to me, to be like, what can we use of what we already have here? And what can I use from stock to discover what shapes I want, so that when I'm out shopping secondhand, I'm not having to overbuy. I'm not doing the typical thing in costumes, which is where you buy lots and lots of options and then you return most of them. But unfortunately, that has become less sustainable, because with fast fashion, half the time the returns aren't being processed. The other half the time you're wasting lots and lots of materials. If you're returning to certain huge companies like Amazon or ASOS, they aren't even like repackaging those items to resell after you return them, because it's not worth it for like the money and just the turnover labor for them. So trying to keep all of that in mind and limit the amount of purchasing and returns you have to do in the first place by doing these fittings that maybe it's not the right item, maybe it's the wrong color, maybe it's you know, maybe you're trying to fit a jacket for a character, but you pull a whole bunch that are the wrong era, the wrong whatever, but they help you understand how this person wears clothes. They help you understand shapes, help you understand like what is needed there. So yeah, so that's kind of early on in the process. Another thing I also want to talk about is expanding costume research early on in the process with um, more historical and more context research being involved. So in Exotic Deadly, we had, like I mentioned, the main character time travel, and part of this process is she goes to like this dark underwater depths of the ocean place, which is like this metaphor for depression and Eastern Asian, like the rash of suicides and things that are very like prevalent in those societies. And so we had to show these folks who had been underwater for a really long time. And like, it was really interesting trying to design this look because I was like, okay, we have like Eastern Asian folks who have been trapped underwater for a long time. What are the things that pull at for me? What is going to feel right for our cast to embody? And so I kind of delved into uh, um, I kind of delved into my background as and like understanding the Korean concept of Han, which is this idea, this like weight and sadness that the Korean people carry because we are this small country in between all these superpowers and have been constantly colonized and oppressed through that. So it's like this deep weight that everyone carries. And kind of compiling research that doesn't necessarily 100% have to do with clothing, but has to do with like the world we're trying to create. So like this pottery piece, it talks about white and the concept of Han and the association with it, and how white in Eastern Asian cultures is this color of mourning, color of sadness, funeral garb. Here they're showing a Japanese man being prepared for burial, and like the traditional clothing, and how uh, you always wear a kimono one direction, and then when you are deceased, you wear it the other direction. And so we had like one of our characters who was wandering through this underwater place in a full kimono, uh, inspired by this Shinto priest, and um, and we took the fabric and we like wrinkled it and starched it until there were all these creases in it and such. But like we were able to do that process because I was able to pull kimonos from stock, fit a couple on the actor until I was like, oh, this is the one I want the approximate shape of. And then we took stock fabric that we already had. I just went through all the fabric they had until I found a white that I liked and did the hung right. And then we built a kimono that we could then mess up because we didn't want to do that to like a really nice, genuine antique silk kimono. Because there is a balance of when you use stock pieces, and if there are like antique pieces or cultural pieces, there is a balance of when to use them, when to not, when to use them as inspiration to build off of, or when to like put them in the show. I do sometimes have to push theater companies to let me put an antique piece actually in a production. But I very much believe that clothing is meant to be used, and even if it is used in a way where it eventually is damaged and can no longer necessarily be used as like a pristine tailcoat that it was originally from like the 1930s and we're reusing, and like it can have another life as something else, even if it gets worn out through a production. I firmly believe in that, and using fabric over and over until it's unusable, even if it means giving it a new life or a new shape or something like that. So yeah, I can show actually. So here you can see the miniature of the kimono that we made out of the test fabric to see what the folds and such would look like. I'm just going to see what the folds and such would look like so that we're making sure we're not using up large amounts of fabric before we go into it. Again, just trying to be aware of resources always and limiting things like that. And also, you know, as part of the process of part of like this ethical identity centering costuming, being able to talk to actors about this piece and show them the process and let them be involved in it was very, I think, empowering for everyone involved. And just very interesting and like really created more character depth in a way that I think was very rewarding. And I think that that's like one of the big things about this process for me is that by keeping it open and by doing that, I allow the actors to even have more investment in the characters. So like, for example, I had this board for Oji-chan. We had him start at the very beginning of the show as very this very like bland scientist. So I literally took like a Getty Images I wanted thing, and then he develops into when the main character realizes he did MSG, he develops into this mad scientist when we went full anime with it. And I wanted to talk about this piece because this is like again, talking about building things from scratch and figuring out balancing purchases. So, for example, we could not find this shiny red vinyl anywhere secondhand. I went through all my sources. Some of my favorites that I go to at the before like the rehearsal period ever starts for a show, I always go to Materials for the Arts. They have lots of amazing fabric and they often have clothes. They have a huge amount of trim and hardware. So if you're ever just like, I just need a color, that's an amazing place to go. A lot of it is heavier industrial fabric, but it's still really great. One of my other favorite places is Fab Scrap, which is a warehouse in Brooklyn and a warehouse in Philly, and they take in all of the textile fashion waste essentially from the fashion district and the fashion industry, and then the fabric is sorted by volunteers and by folks who work there into natural synthetics so that the fabric can be reused. Sometimes it's like sometimes it's reused as like shreds, sometimes it's huge bolts of fabric that a fashion house decided they weren't going to use this year and otherwise would have thrown away. And you can, you know, costume an entire show out of there. They also do an amazing thing. They have a section called Mendables. So this is Fab Scrap, like I said. They have a section called Mendables, and those are all of the sample garments that, you know, are developed in the fashion district. And they often have like lines on them from development of like, oh, we want to change these seams and things. Or sometimes they're perfectly good pieces of clothing that they've just like taken scissors to and put a slash through so that it can't be resold for anything of worth. But you can find even like designer tag things there that like I have like a Hervé Leger thing and like some other amazing pieces from Fab Scrap that I found in their racks and racks of mendable clothing because it's just being thrown out by the fashion industry. So like, again, that's what I was saying of there's lots of resources of things, and that's how one of the ways I keep material costs low. You can even big tip, if you really need to, you can even get things for free at FabScrap. If you volunteer to sort fabric there, for I think just 3 hours or like 2 or 3 hours, you get 5 pounds of free whatever you want, and that's fabric that's the mendable, like actual pieces of clothing, that's trim, that's they also have a whole section of fabric that is just free, like pay what you want, because it's uh they have so much that they are just trying to make sure it's being turned over and being used. And they have a bunch of amazing designers that they also highlight there. But I was not able to find shiny red vinyl in the amount that I needed for this coat at FabScrap or at Mifta or at Swanson Fabrics is a great one. But I also recommend just signing up for this website called the Fiber Arcade, that is all of these fiber clothing sewing people who all believe in like secondhand reusing textiles and are just constantly posting about things that they have found and are sharing, or all the small reuse stores that have been popping up around the country, and are like really great, amazing resources. Because it's not just clothing and fabric. There's also like a free art supply closet chain that has started, which is really amazing. I know there's one here in Astoria, I believe. I believe there's one in Astoria, that's just like free to the public, whereas materials for the arts, you do have to be with a nonprofit or like with an educational organization. But FabScrap is free to anyone who volunteers there, and it's extremely, extremely affordable, even if you're not volunteering and you just want to go and shop. And they do things like online appointments and such if you are not in Brooklyn or Philly and can't make it out to those spaces. So yeah, those are some of the resources I highly recommend and that I always, always go to for fabric when I know I'm building something from scratch before I try and buy fabric secondhand. In this case, I was not able to do that, but I was able to use, so this was at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego, this production. I should have mentioned that earlier. And I was able to use like the vendors that they have consistently used and have relationships with to buy the vinyl. But then for all the other pieces, the trim, the buttons, the pocket flaps, all of those, because we did outline it all in black shiny leather as well, and then these statement black buttons, as you can see on the coat. And so like those I just pulled from stock. I went through their entire button cabinet and like just really took the time to go through and pull out different options and hold them up and look at that, instead of immediately jumping to purchasing something, or or asking them to pick something for me and then not being able to like look at it and touch it myself. So my process does involve a lot more of my time than I would say the way capitalism has forced costume processes to go. Usually the designer does not get to be around and be as hands-on as I am. But because I am buying things secondhand, because I'm looking at things and constantly picturing how they can be reworked and reimagined to be useful to me, it's a hard like skill to teach, or it's a hard like thing to invite someone into the brain of until they've kind of experienced it. Although this was really amazing, the Old Globe was really great in that they had a full costume shop and were able to like sit with me and talk about labor and when we could, when we actually had the labor to be doing all of the building and such. And like, as I said, I'm taking all these secondhand pieces and changing them and altering them. So it does require a lot more labor than material focus. And that was really great with the Old Globe to be able to be like, this is what these couple weeks are when we have more labor, and this is when we have less. And actually, because of that, was able to do things like, so I went before, I went to San Diego before rehearsal had started. And like I said, I pulled from their stock and we were able to make this specific jacket piece. So this was a jacket that I thrifted during my first visit, and then I took a shirt from stock that had all of the characters' colors, purple, brown, green, pink stripes, and we like cut that shirt up and patchworked it onto this jacket, so that we already had kind of like the character's signature statement piece. Here you can see where we patchworked the shirt on. We already had this piece to like work off of before the actor was ever in the building. And then it was just a matter of, as you can see, trying on different shirts, all from stock, all secondhand, underneath this piece that we had already made. We were also able, I highly recommend making as many connections as you can with local thrift stores, because we were able to go to, in this case, the thrift store Flashbacks and pull things on Memo. Again, this required pulling things on Memo from a store. Sorry, excuse me. Pulling things on Memo from a store means we pull them from a secondhand place, and we have like written out everything that we've pulled. We don't pay for everything until we know which items we're using. We have a certain like a couple, maybe like a week to like fit things and then return them. So we were able to like find these amazing bell bottom, like these metallic purple bell bottoms, because at the end of the show this character has her like Lizzie McGuire finale musical moment, and we were able to pull those from Flashbacks and fit them and memo them out, and then return the ones that we didn't use because there were a couple different, they had like a more pinkish purple and a couple other sizes and things like that, and so these were the ones we kept. But like I said, that kind of memoing things out from a thrift store does require trust, does require an established relationship. So I'm always asking theaters when I get there, what thrift stores have they worked with? Who do they have established relationships with? This one was really great. This process was really great because before I arrived in the city, I asked them if they could like let me know what thrift stores and specifically what Asian American owned clothing stores they could locate. And my assistant there, Natalie, put together an amazing, extremely thorough list of like all the thrift stores in the immediate San Diego area, and then also Asian American owned stores that were, yes, new items, and then also a couple Asian American owned thrift stores. So I was able to like really focus my spending in those places. So I knew I was giving back directly to the community that we're representing on stage, and that I was directing the capital that I had, which, you know, is not necessarily a huge amount. I'm not spending huge amounts of money. The budget for this was small. And but I do think that those amounts of money matter. And a huge part of what I do is then like connecting those stores to the production in other ways of like, can we highlight these stores online? Can we let all the actors know that these are where the pieces were bought and they go back and shop there? Can we let the audience know? Like, because there are so many times where people are like, I wish I could be wearing the clothes on stage, because my costumes are so much about bringing out like an affirming identity, joyful thing that I feel like that feeds into the audience, and then they want to know where things are from, and then they can be supporting, you know, the community that they didn't know they had, these resources they didn't know they had. We like, for example, on this production, it was really great. We went to a cute Korean owned store, and like I ended up bonding with the store owner and like talking about how my dad was Korean and her mom is Korean, and like buying a couple of small pieces from there, but also just being able to like have that connection and let people know this production is happening. And One of the things I do often and request on my work is like, what is the accessibility for the target audience? You know, what is the discount code for the Asian American audience? I did a show in Cincinnati, and I was able to like go out to the community and go to like the Asian grocery stores and like the downtown markets and such, and give them programs that had like the discount code on the front and be like, hi, it's great to meet you. This is happening in your community. And there was like, we created like an Asian affinity space for after the show where people were able to go and sit and eat fruit, because that's, you know, one of our love languages, and drink tea and things like that, which was really amazing. Great. Oh, so I was talking about discussing labor and discussing labor availability with a theater and with the costume department ahead of time, and figuring out where to stack things. With this production, like I said, we front loaded as much as possible, but then there were also a lot of things that, because it's a new play, you want to leave some amount of flexibility for. And so that does sometimes mean that like I thrift shop and I buy things that I think are for a specific character, and they don't end up being used for that character, but because they are of the world, they end up being used later. For example, at one point you can see these folks in these purple shirts and jackets and hats. We just needed people to be able to run on stage and be tourists for like 1 second, but not be their distinctive other characters, which have very strong, like bright pink and bright orange color schemes. And so because our world was Ami and purple, I had all these other purple layers already pulled for Ami that we didn't end up using, but we kept around because they might be useful. They were of the world. And I was able to then be like, oh, great. I don't have to go shopping for these costumes. I don't have to spend more money. We have these pieces right here. These were all stock items, but it could have been like one of the shirts was purchased for the show, and that was how we ended up using it. All right, so like I said, so then we have our first round of fittings, those exploratory fittings, those fittings that are stock items, or some secondhand items. And then I go even further, shopping secondhand, and like I said, shopping BIPOC owned. I also quite often do, if I have to buy like basics or things that aren't even necessarily seen on stage, I try to shop Indigenous owned as much as possible, try to shop those stores, because you know they're already doing ethical labor practices, and because they have sustainability built in through local materials, through those kind of things. So like for this show, there was at one point where someone's just wearing a basic t-shirt under something, but we purchased it from an LA-based Asian American sustainable streetwear brand, and it was able to like tie in that way, which was really amazing. So even though it's like a basic that's not necessarily being seen, because I am saving so much money on the bulk of my materials, I'm then able to redirect my funds and spend a little more on a quote unquote basic t-shirt than I would usually spend on, you know, if I were on a production years ago, if I was doing a production, or if I was assisting on a show and just shopping as many options as possible, I'd just be hitting all the fast fashion places, and I would be paying maybe a fifth of the price, but it would also be fifth of the quality, and the money is very much not going towards the community that I am depicting on stage, which for me is really the biggest thing. And then, like I said, having this flexibility in tech, these different, this kind of closet of this world that I have developed of all of these 90s pieces, all of the things that could be in the world. And then I wanted to talk about the development of one specific costume, actually. So this character is that you can see right here is our actual MSG, the product as a person. And so we're really focusing on like the Harajuku idea, and I kind of dived too far into it almost. And this is what I'm talking about with flexibility and tech of like, I made this character extremely stylish in my opinion. And then we realized that she had to be more of a product, more of a consideration of a like a male gaze influence on her. But this was like where we had started of like, these are all secondhand pieces that we pulled, and kind of I built this idea of a look of like I had this vest, I had these emoji pins, and these like I had a bunch of these banana hats, so we like cut those up, turned them into shoulder epaulets. We're adding all these like secondhand pieces, just as much like shiny yellow and blue texture as I could get on there. Also some things that are like food related utensils, as well as like chopsticks and such in the hair. And then we kind of slowly developed that look until it was different, and like pared it back, took away like the raincoat options, but the raincoat option here, and took off the boots and had her in like knee socks instead. All these things to like put this a little bit of this male gaze influence into it. But we were able to do that because we kind of like went there and then we're able to pull back. And I'm always very much the person that's like maximalism as often as possible. One of the things I say is I try to work from a place of surplus and not I try to work from a place of abundance, not scarcity, is what I meant to say, not surplus, but same thing. Abundance, not scarcity, because we really do have an abundance of materials. We really do have an abundance of things in this world that we can use and change and alter. And so kind of expanding onto that, one of the things that I have been doing is I do collect a lot of personal stock. And so for shows that don't have access to a full huge theater like the Old Globe, like that huge amount of stock, I do have some personal stock that I keep. You can actually see my little sneak into my studio. That is my wall of accessories. My ADHD brain needs to display everything so that I know what stock I have. And sometimes when I'm in a design process, I will literally sit and I'll turn and stare at my wall of accessories and be like, oh, actually, that's a jumping off point for a character. Like, what if they had that accessory? And like, you can design from there. It's often about finding that like one thing that really speaks to a character, and then you can build around that with secondhand items. One thing that speaks to the building around with secondhand items. And then what else can I show you? So like, for example, we had one character that was literally just the Chinese restaurant lady in this show. And so we pulled this like wild vest from stock that had a different logo on it. And then we're able to find the same fabric, more of that same fabric in stock, take it to this screen printer they'd started developing a relationship with, print it on that, and reuse the vest by just putting this new backing on it, things like that that we were able to do. This hat, this ally hat, is inspired by like Virgil Abloh's off-white labeling things and then signing them. And so we had a character who was like this producer that comes in the middle and is like, I think the white actors should be featured more, to the main Asian lead. And he's like, I'm an ally, and has all of his little like buttons and such. But like, this was a hat that I just had already in stock, and I happened to have with me in San Diego because it was a hat that sometimes I wore. And I was like, actually, this is perfect for this. And then again, we took it to a screen printer that they had started a relationship with. and printed it. So yeah, just lots of things about like how we took items that existed. What else can I talk about? Um, things that existed. Yeah, I guess that's if we want to open it up for questions, or I can keep talking in depth about this specific production. I can also talk about I have one of the things that I am currently doing and want to introduce to all of you as a resource and let people know about is like the other costume resources in New York, like I've mentioned, FabScrap, Materials for the Arts. I should also mention TDF, which is the costume collection in Queens, which rents out costumes. And if you're a nonprofit or educational, huge discounts. And they take kind of all the period costumes from Broadway and the Met Opera and things like that and have them. But something that I have been exploring recently is like, where do modern contemporary clothes go? Especially because with fast fashion, contemporary clothes don't necessarily last very long, or they don't have anything material wise that's been invested in them. You know, like a lot of the pieces I wear are vintage because they have interesting patterns that have been developed and that time has been taken. And so what I've been doing is I've developed an experiment right now. I'm calling it Transcendent Punk. I've been doing it for the past 8 months, where I've been collecting costumes from New York and New York area productions as they close, costumes that don't have anywhere to go other than a corporate thrift store like Goodwill or Salvation Army, which do not pay their people well and are now pricing their clothing in a way where it is not accessible to the communities that they're trying to serve. You know, with all the reselling online, it's become more and more difficult for people to go just into a thrift store. So what I've collected costumes for the past 8 months, and I'm continuing to do so, of mainly modern clothing, some period stuff, some random things like animal onesies or astronaut helmets or things like that. And then I am redistributing them and keeping them as a resource for trans and BIPOC artists in New York to use essentially for free, but paying a small fee if you are white, paying a small fee if you're cis, and trying to make these costumes available to people and to just model how you can keep contemporary clothing and reuse it, and how it's possible to sorry for the voice breaks. Like I said, I am a trans non-binary person and I'm on testosterone, so that, and that's been going on for like 6 months, so the voice cracks happen because this new voice is still developing. But showing that these materials can be reused, that the materials can have another purpose, and that we can connect our theater community and our productions on stage to folks in the community here in person. You know, what happens to the clothes after a show? What happens to the costumes after a show closes? How can we make sure that we're actually breaking these binaries of what is professional and where can resources go and what is allowed in a theater space? You know, because we draw so much inspiration from different communities, especially queer communities. As a theater maker, I draw so much from ballroom specifically, that this experiment has been about taking theater resources and then making them available for the ballroom community. I was actually invited and have joined a ballroom house, the House of Transcendence. And we, in April, we threw a sustainable, a sustainable ball at Soho Rep to highlight how you can reuse these costumes. And actually we'll be sharing photos and videos on Instagram fairly soon from that, of just like, and showing some before and after pictures of like we took like a furry like onesie set that was like a top and a bottom and a hat, and we turned it into like a glamorous crop top with these like big bell sleeves and a little skirt that matched, and like just like it was really amazing to encourage people to look at things as fabric first. And I think that like if you take anything away from this and from breaking the binaries of capitalism and of gender when you are costuming, it's like everything is fabric, and it can be sewn together or reused or painted or dyed or cut up or sewn back together. Like you can do so much with things, and limiting yourself to like, this is a t-shirt, it has to stay as a t-shirt, or this is a button-down shirt, it has to stay as a button-down shirt. Really breaking through that then allows you to be much more creative with your costuming, much more sustainable, and much more flexible in your whole process. Like one of my favorite things to do, for example, with button-down shirts is like, if you take two button-down shirts that have similar size buttons and holes, you can button two of them together and now you have a skirt or a dress, or you can do five of them and you have a train, or you have a giant shirt that people can dance in. Like I'm doing a show right now, an experimental musical, and a lot of what we're talking about is like, how do these clothes get worn by people, and how is taking them off and on stage part of the process. And like we were able to have some workshop time and discover like it's really interesting to have like this one really tall older masculine actor and a really short feminine younger actress like in this one giant sweater, pulling at the edges of it, and like that contrast, and not expecting to see two people in one garment, or like a lot of what I look at is the cycles of fashion. So like one of the things you can spot once you've done some costuming work is that like fashion cycled for a long time. It cycled like every 20 years. And so if you wanted to do something that was from a certain period, you would look at like the more recent thrift things. So like if you wanted to do 1940s looks, you can look at the 1980s garments where they did a lot of 1940s inspired suitwear, inspired lines, inspired things like that. And like if you just tweak it a little bit, it can read as completely period on stage. 1970s prairie dresses are hugely inspired by like much earlier in the 1910s, even. And so like I've done shows where everyone is, just post-Victorian, but they're all actually wearing all 1970s clothing, but it looks like of the period, because when you put it together right, or you accessorize it right, or like alter it just a little bit, you can make things then read as that. So that's one of my favorite tips, is like to look at cycles of fashion. And if you're doing something that is period now, what is the most recent time it came up as a trend in things? And also to look at like different cultural inspirations and drawing from different places, of like, okay, that's what was happening period wise here, but what was happening over here that got like shipped over, I recently was teaching and working with these amazing young artists at Vibe Pages to Stages, and we were talking about how they were looking at vintage in stores, and they found this suit that was from a Japanese company that they wanted to put on their character, and they felt weird about it. And I was like, but a lot of clothing was manufactured in Japan at that time. It is not incorrect. And like, you can look at all the trends in the US, especially of when different countries and cultures become popular and like are then available in the US. So there's a huge surplus of Japanese and Chinese textiles here that like I was able to use for a show that I was doing in like a very specific 1860s Chinese woman's look. And I was able to find textiles, because so much had been imported, from that time period, and so much of like recreations of that time period had then been imported. Of like really being able to be like, I can do all of this secondhand. I can buy all of these traditional garments, you know, that often people don't even realize are worth something. Like I spend all hours and hours on eBay and Etsy looking for these pieces that I can then transform and reuse. And like was able to find antique 19th century Chinese embroidery pieces that, you know, there was never one full intact robe. Well, there were, but we couldn't afford those. Never one full intact robe, but I was able to get a collar from here and cuffs from here and bottom border trim from here and closures from here. And then we use current secondhand fabric that still has a life and can make it through a theater run, and is stronger, and then add all those antique pieces on top of it, and able to then like create something that really looks like it was of the time period without having to, you know, create new embroidery ourselves and things like that. Um, oh, I guess the final thing I want to talk about is, I think a question that I come across a lot is like, how do I balance valuing anti-capitalism when I have like a show budget, you know, and like that reality of it. Like I said, number one, getting as many free secondhand materials as possible, doing as much essentially scavenging as possible, so that I can then focus my money on labor, on paying people who have the skills, the people who are actually making costumes, who know how to sew, and take these things to them and pay them for all of their time properly, so that I know I'm supporting a costume industry, so that I know these people will continue to have work, and so that I'm, you know, paying a person as opposed to a company as much as possible. For example, I'm doing a musical and I'm spending over half of my budget on my associate, because it is important to me to have that person there. And because this experimental musical that we're doing, we're trying to use all secondhand items. We're trying to, you know, the idea is to rebuild and make things, and like there's drag in it. So you got to make things custom because, you know, we're going to make weird things for that. And drag always requires playing with shape and gender and exaggeration that you're not necessarily going to find in like clothes you can just buy off the rack. But you can take 3 items out of a storage bin and smash them together and do that. But that requires someone who knows how to do that, someone who you can value. And often when you bring in these additional artists, it like feeds into the process even more of just like, your brain works different than mine. You know how to take this garment and rebuild it in this way, and we can bounce off of each other. And like that value and that ability is like, again, I can't stress how much I'm just like, please, please, please pay our stitchers and like involve them more in the process. And whenever possible, even on like much smaller shows that I do, where it's like a tiny show that's 2 people, like 2 actors, 2 costumes kind of thing, I will spend most of my budget on a person as opposed to materials, because having that person in the room with me, having more queer folks, more folks with different mindsets in the space is what's ultimately really important, and makes the process humane and ethical. And, you know, we can all of our different perspectives, we can highlight all the different, like, hey, let's wave a flag at this, of this person being paid, or like, oh, here, this is actually going to require more labor. We can discuss that and where it fits in. Yeah, so I guess I would end there.
That was so fantastic, Hahnji. I was like taking so many notes. That was really brilliant. Thank you so much
Yes,
for being a part of this. And I just want to uplift again everything you said, of course, but specifically the end about paying people and about labor equity, because sometimes I think theaters and institutions forget that that is a core part of any type of effort towards equity. Thank you so much for our attendees here in the Zoom. Thank you for folks on YouTube. And this was our last Global Learn of the festival this year, but we will be back. And yeah, thank you so much, Hahnji.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great,
Yeah.
folks.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.